Hello everyone, I'm Kirsten.
And I'm Franz.
And we're here to pump you up.
You up. I'm sorry, Kirsten. Maybe if you changed your name to Hans, it might sound better. I'm sorry.
I'm Kirsten Hines, and this is Franz Brexton, and we're here to talk to you about 7 common mistakes made in 2D models. These are mistakes that are either caught during QC or we have caught in models by others.
This presentation is for those of you who create 2D models on the day-to-day, those who QC 2D models, and for any communities out there that want to know what they should look for in 2D models that you receive from consultants. Some of the content may be specific to HEC-RAS 2D, but the concepts are transferable to other 2D models as well.
We won't share any names or projects, just focus on better ways to model in 2D. We've got a lot to cover in a short amount of time, so let's dive into our first topic, break lines. We do need to be conscious regarding the use of break lines and the locations where we place them. Let's take a look at how flows are modeled across the mesh to better understand break line placement. As you can see here, the flows are transferred from grid cell to grid cell, where each grid cell edge is reading the underlying terrain.
You're talking about how in HEC-RAS 2D, using subgrid bathymetry, each face of the mesh element is represented by a cross-section, right?
Yes, the flows in the model are directed from mesh element to mesh element based on these tiny cross-sections. When a break line is enforced into a mesh, new grid cells along the break line are created. As you can see here, a correctly enforced break line will have grid cell edges along the entire break line. That way, all tiny cross-sections along the break line accurately portray the terrain you're trying to enhance. Let's take a sec and look at this incorrectly drawn break line and how it impacts the results. This break line is drawn along the embankment crest along a large pond. In this particular scenario, flows are directed towards the pond where the embankment should prevent the flows from entering the pond. But what problem do you see with this enforced break line? The grid cells along the break line are jagged and not a continual line representing the crest of the embankment. Based on the way the terrain is read along the grid cell edges, the model thinks that the embankment crest is jagged and dips down, allowing water to flow into the pond. Even though the actual depth of the pond is below the embankment crest, the model doesn't recognize the embankment is solid. Therefore, the model allows flows to move through the embankment.
This can really impact whether or not an area is actually flooded. Similarly, this can also lead to false shallow flooding if too much flow is diverted in the wrong direction due to a bad break line.
It can also cause flows to leak from a stream if a break line at the top of the bank isn't enforced correctly. A key thing to remember is that break lines need to be drawn at high points and correctly enforced to accurately portray the terrain in the model. Now, you might be asking, how do I fix break lines in my model?
In this example, it looks to me like the break lines are too close together and the mesh elements can't form between the two at the specified size.
Refraining from drawing break lines too close to each other is one way to prevent this from happening, but sometimes you may need break lines to be closer together. Another tool to utilize is the Edit Break Line Cell Spacing function. This allows the modeler to manually set minimum and maximum cell spacing to fit in between break lines.
It's important to have break lines at high points in the terrain, including the top of banks, embankment crests, and general high areas.
Here's an example where placing the break line slightly off from the top of the crest resulted in falsely flooding this particular area. Moving the break line slightly, the model no longer showed the area flooding. The only way to identify the sensitivity of break line placement is to understand the topography under the area being modeled.
As modelers, we need to be asking ourselves, do the results make sense to be showing flooding in an area beyond higher areas in the terrain?
Absolutely. Critically examining your results and knowing the topography within the area of interest will help you identify areas of false flooding due to a bad or missing break line. Which brings me to our next mistake, trusting the terrain.
We are going to dive right into an example to kick off our next topic. This goes back to what we said earlier. Know your terrain. Now, I'm the kind of modeler to put some water on the mesh, see where it goes, and then make educated changes to the model based on the initial results. That wasn't quite enough for me in this case. I was modeling a very wide, very long floodplain with high flow rates for a long duration. To get results in a time frame that the client needed, I had to increase my average mesh element size to 200 feet by 200 feet. The floodplain was in this large agricultural area with berms here, berms there. Suffice it to say, I missed an important levee that redirects flow. I was using HEC-RAS 2D and trusted the terrain too much, thinking the subgrid bathymetry would pick up major features, and that's when I had the hard lesson in how HEC-RAS 2D works. It was actually the inspiration behind this presentation. So learn from me, don't just trust the model and the terrain, and take the time to study the area you're modeling and use break lines.
So Franz, what's our next topic?
Our next topic is runtime.
I think when I first started modeling, I thought that the runtime didn't really matter. You just try and get a lot of detail into the model and let the thing do its thing.
You could do that and just plan ahead, but you lose time each time you pick the model back up after you've been working on something else for a while. Not to mention the fire drills that come up and distract you from getting back to the model. So our modeler mistake here is creating models that take too long to run, causing project delays or time loss getting yourself caught up on a model due to long inactive periods.
There's actually quite a bit to this topic, and it really can depend on what model you're trying to run. For instance, large rain-on-grid models probably would take several hours to complete. Why? Because you're loading every single mesh element in the watershed, whereas in a riverine model, only the elements in a floodplain are wet. The more wet mesh elements, the longer the runtime.
Let's take a step back though. The main elements that affect your model runtime are your mesh element size and time step. Taking a step even further back, mesh element size is driven by your terrain and the desired level of detail you're trying to get out of the model. For starters, let's talk about the kind of runtime you should target for certain kinds of models. We recognize this will vary, but we're going to advocate that, for instance, riverine models that are half a mile or less and have a floodplain width less than 200 feet should have a runtime under 10 minutes. I want to give a shout out to Brian Varela in CDOT Region 4 for inspiring this criteria. Hey Brian, do you think he heard me?
I don't know, but we should keep going.
Right, yeah. So what does this mean? This means that your model with a 1 foot by 1 foot mesh element size with a 0.1 second time step is very detailed and will likely produce stable results. But it is probably overkill and will give you a runtime close to 30 minutes to several hours for just a half-mile long model. That's a long time to wait when your stream design or getting results to your client hinge on getting answers back quickly.
Like Franz mentioned earlier in his story, for a 60-mile long model whose floodplain is 3 miles wide, to get the results in a realistic time frame, you should be considering larger mesh elements like 100-foot or 200-foot wide elements with 30-foot elements in small tributary streams. Keep in mind your time step should follow the smallest mesh element, not the largest, which we'll talk about in a minute. So for this size model, it should take several days to run. But remember what we said about the terrain and the break lines. Large mesh elements require more attention to break lines.
You might be wondering then what we would recommend to avoid this downtime. Biggest tip here, perform a sensitivity analysis on different grid cell sizes and find the right mesh size and time step that will give you reliable, stable results in a time frame that is realistic and get you the information you need and ultimately saves you time.
Franz, what would you say to someone who wants a lot of detail in a low flow channel centerline?
To that I say, you won't know until you try, and you don't have to take my word for it. Honestly, I think you'll be surprised comparing the results from a really small mesh element size to the results of a large mesh element size.
Here's some general rules for the time steps we use. Real stable results can be found at 1:40 ratio, meaning if your mesh element is 40 feet wide by 40 feet, then a 1 second time step will produce a stable result. From our experience, results become unstable around a 1:10 ratio. Using the previous example, this would mean a 4-second time step would be the max you'd go to for a 40-foot mesh element.
If you want to dive even deeper than that, consider basing time step on the velocity of flow through your smallest mesh element. There's a neat tool in HEC-RAS 2D that I'll share if you haven't found it yet. It's the variable time step tool that uses the Courant number, a calculation of the velocity over the size of your mesh element, to automatically adjust your time step. Clicking those little ellipses button right next to your time step takes you to that tool.
Like we said, a lot to cover, but hopefully these suggestions will help reduce that time to a more realistic time frame. The next mistake I'd like to bring up is regarding Manning's roughness values. Initially, I kind of thought applying Manning's roughness values to my model was pretty straightforward. It seemed like something that doesn't need a lot of attention.
The process of adding Manning's values is pretty straightforward, but there is a lot of room for assumptions and lack of definition that can actually impact your model.
Let's take a step back and start with the importance of applying Manning's roughness values. The roughness values are used to account for losses in accordance to different land uses. Without applying roughness values, a 2D model will apply a single non-varying roughness value across the entire 2D mesh area.
Forgetting to apply spatially varied roughness won't break your model, but it's not good practice. Understandably, it could be forgotten or lost because it's an external file that's referenced to the model. Results can change quickly when different roughness values are used, but it obviously varies by model to model.
Some models may be more sensitive to slight changes to roughness values and show changes in flooding depth and flood extents significantly. Others may show slight changes. It's a good rule of thumb to calibrate 2D models by running the model with different roughness values through a sensitivity analysis. By different values, I suggest starting with base values, then increasing or decreasing those values by a percentage, possibly 10%, or a value that would keep the values in a realistic range for the particular land uses. For an example, let's take a look at results from 3 different model runs. On the left side of the screen, we have results from the decreased values. In the middle is our base value results, and on the right, we have the results from the increased values. In this example, there are noticeable changes between the flood depth, extents, and velocities.
With a sensitive model like this, the changes in the results would be a red flag to the modeler to check and verify the accuracy of the roughness values being used.
Some ways to verify the roughness values are to double check land use extents and asking ourselves whether or not the values are high or low based on our knowledge of the terrain, vegetation, and the existing or proposed channel conditions.
One other thing to keep in mind is there are times when 2D models need higher roughness values than a 1D model. Detailed flood modeling guidance from Australia discusses how 2D roughness values need to be increased if the grid or mesh resolution in the 2D domain is coarse, to account for the bend losses or losses in addition to bed frictional losses. Our next mistake I've seen several times, and each modeler does it slightly different than the other. It's boundary condition placement.
When we first talked about this one, Franz, I have to admit, I couldn't see where you're going with this. As I started modeling in 2D, I thought we just put an upstream boundary condition and a downstream boundary condition that covers the end of the model and call it good.
I mean, yes and no. Boundary condition size also matters, and it matters more depending on which 2D modeling software you're using. I think the downstream boundary is the easiest to start with. Think of the downstream boundary like a bucket that's going to catch all of the water that you put onto the computational mesh. Placement is important so that all water that enters the grid has an opportunity to leave. One mistake made is not making the downstream boundary condition wide enough. This is the same as trying to catch Niagara Falls with a bucket. You're going to miss some of the water. If you don't catch all of it, your water surface elevations may artificially influence your results.
One catch-all advanced modelers learn over time is placing the downstream boundary condition far enough downstream. This can avoid any potential issues with a narrow downstream boundary condition, but the safest thing to do is to make it wider than your floodplain to catch all of those flows.
Why upstream boundary conditions matter is because they behave very differently depending on the 2D model you're using. Some 2D models are smart enough to load the flows at the lowest point and increase in width depending on the amount of flow, while others assume you want the flow evenly distributed across the boundary condition line. It goes back to getting results you can trust. SRH2D via SMS, for instance, assumes you want the flows evenly distributed across the line. This is okay if your boundary condition matches the width of the flow that you're modeling, but if your line is too wide, you'll be showing water in the overbank where there should be none.
So, the best option to avoid overestimating your flood limits near the point where flow is being loaded is to stick an upstream boundary condition that is the same size or smaller than your floodplain width.
And remember, just like the downstream boundary, to avoid any influence on your results from the upstream boundary condition, it's best to place that upstream boundary condition far enough upstream to allow the flows to spread out to the floodplain.
Now to a topic we've heard asked at nearly every 2D modeling presentation for the last 5 years. When do you use a 2D model?
I'm so glad we're talking about this. I've heard this question many times over the last 10 years or so as 2D modeling has become more mainstream. The answer I've heard given is it depends. I'm going to go one step further though and truly try to answer the question. Through this discussion, we're hoping we'll all get on the same page, knowing when to scope a 2D model and when not to.
1D models are great for uniform channels, where the channel width dominates the total floodplain width, and the overbank width is small. 1D models become less effective the moment split flows start occurring.
How much water goes down the split? Where does the split start? And where does it end? What kind of weir coefficient did you use? Did you set the lateral structures to optimize? How come the 1D model with the split isn't optimizing? Are we using ineffective flows or blocked obstructions to block the water from getting to certain areas of the model? These are all questions you have to answer when modeling split flows in 1D.
2D models aren't perfect, but the underlying terrain answers a lot of those questions that come up when trying to model split flows in 1D.
Split flows are sometimes a total separation from the main channel, or they are where flows partially separate and then reconverge later downstream. Let's look at some actual examples to show you what we're talking about.
This example on First Creek. When modeled in 1D, it looked like the whole right overbank was flooded, but when modeled in 2D, the flooding actually occurred from the downstream to upstream, not the other way around. This is when 2D modeling is needed.
This example on Cherry Creek is downstream of Cherry Creek Reservoir, where the creek is almost entirely contained in its banks. This is where 2D modeling is not really required, and a 1D model would be more than efficient.
There's this example out on Boulder Creek with the gravel mining ponds, where the main channel is very small in comparison to the broader, wider floodplain. The undersized bridges on Boulder Creek force water into the overbanks, and the majority of the flows changes from the right overbank to the left overbank. This is the perfect opportunity for a 2D model with careful attention to ponds and break lines to better define the terrain.
These examples aside, there's the standard things to consider, like what is the effective model? How is the 2D model being used? Is there enough budget to do both? Or is the model for permitting a no-rise, a clomer, or a loamer? Hopefully this has helped answer one of the primary questions: which type of model would be more efficient to develop?
Our next mistake we're seeing is modelers spending a lot of time trying to get the perfect floodway encroachments to achieve less than a half a foot rise. So here's some suggestions to help avoid this mistake.
It's definitely easy to lose track of time trying to model encroachments to achieve that half a foot rise in Colorado or a 1 foot rise if you're in other states. So trick number 1 is know where flow is going. Take 5 minutes to understand how much water is in the main channel versus the areas that you're encroaching into. Cutting off a major flow path will definitely cause a large surcharge outside the allowable range. Trick number 2 is pay attention to the terrain. If you allow water to flow into a low spot like a canal or a roadside ditch, but don't allow for that water to drain, you'll get a large surcharge in that location. Trick number 3 is pay attention to flow depth, velocity, and direction of flow, and unit discharge, or like some people call it, depth times velocity. All of these are indicators of how to build your encroachment. For example, encroaching into shallow areas will produce less of a surcharge. Velocity and direction of flow can help you shape the encroachment to match what's happening in the terrain. Finally, unit discharge acts as a kind of heat map, identifying areas you definitely want to avoid encroaching into. I've generally found good success in areas where the unit discharge is less than a value of 5. Trick number 4 isn't so much a trick, but an alternative method for calculating surcharge using evaluation lines. Consider using this method when you have surcharges within half a foot of the allowable range. In Colorado, that is negative surcharges down to negative 0.5 feet, all the way up to positive surcharges of 1 foot. Finally, I want to point back to our second mistake: overly long run times. Modeling encroachments is tricky and can take multiple iterations to get it just right. Reducing that model runtime can help speed up your ability to try different encroachments.
Thanks, Franz. Speaking to all the attendees, what encroachment tricks might we have missed? Add any that you use to the comments of the presentation. We hope that you have found our presentation interesting and informative. As we said at the start, our goal is to help our modeling community get better, find efficiencies, and collaborate. We talked about proper use of break lines, appropriate run times, taking advantage of variable roughness, strategic boundary placement, trusting terrain data too much, when to use 2D models, and tips for 2D floodway encroachments.
If you found this information interesting, know of other common mistakes that we didn't cover, or have more questions, please feel free to reach out to us at kirsten.hines@jacobs.com and franz.lambrechtsen@jacobs.com. We look forward to answering any of your questions here today. Until next time.
See you on the flip side.